At Chicago O'Hare, a black woman in a sharp gray suit collapses mid-flight line, clutching her chest as passengers gasp. A smug flight attendant, Victor Hensley, smirks, muttering, probably faking it for attention, and demands she step aside or face removal. She steadies herself, eyes blazing, and whispers, "You'll regret this." Moments later, medics whisk her away, leaving Victor unfazed. Little does he know, she's the FAA's top regulator, and this spark will ignite a wildfire that burns his world down. What happens when prejudice picks the wrong fight? Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against all odds, hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales of truth. Clashing with power. The terminal at Chicago O'Hare buzzed with the chaotic hum of early morning travelers, a symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the sharp clack of heels on polished tile. Victor Hensley navigated the throng with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent a decade wrangling passengers for United Airlines. At 38, he was wiry, with a pinched face framed by dark hair combed tight against his scalp. His uniform, a crisp navy blue with red piping, hugged his lean frame, every crease ironed to a razor's edge. He carried himself with a strut, shoulders squared, chest puffed slightly, as if the gate area were his personal kingdom. 5 cups of black coffee pulsed through his veins, a necessity after 3 consecutive cross-country shifts that had left him hollow-eyed and jittery. He thrived on the power of his clipboard and the authority stitched into his name tag, a badge of control in an otherwise unpredictable job. Today, he was assigned to Flight 632, a 7 a.m. departure bound for Seattle, and the boarding process was already underway at Gate C-17. The digital clock above the desk blinked 6:45, a silent nag that they were cutting it close. Victor scanned the crowd with a predator's eye, his gaze flicking over faces, sizing up potential troublemakers. A businessman barked into his phone, a harried mother wrestled a stroller, a teenage girl scrolled TikTok with glazed indifference. Routine. Then his eyes snagged on a woman standing near the edge of the priority boarding lane. She was black, in her late 40s, with a presence that cut through the terminal's clamor like a blade. Her gray suit was tailored to perfection, hugging her frame with quiet elegance, the kind of polish that screamed money or influence. A leather briefcase hung from her shoulder, its surface scuffed but expensive, and her posture was ramrod straight, unshaken by the delay that had just flickered across the departure board, 15 minutes late due to a fueling snag. She stood, apart from the grumbling masses, her face a mask of calm, her eyes fixed on some distant point as if the chaos didn't touch her. Victor's stomach twisted, a sour knot forming beneath his ribs. Something about her cool detachment rubbed him raw, like she was above it all, above him. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his jacket, and strode toward her, his boots clicking against the floor with purpose. The line shuffled forward, passengers clutching boarding passes, but Victor zeroed in on her alone. "Ma'am," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the din, "you're holding up the line." It was a lie. She stood exactly where she belonged, in the first-class queue, her carry-on resting neatly by her feet. Heads turned, a ripple of attention spreading through the crowd. The woman's gaze shifted to him, dark eyes steady and unblinking, like she was sizing him up in return. "I'm in my correct zone," she replied, her tone even, measured, the kind of voice that didn't rise to meet his bait. She didn't flinch, didn't fidget, just stood there, a pillar of composure that made his skin prickle. Victor's jaw tightened. He didn't like her tone, didn't like the way she looked at him, like he was a bug under a magnifying glass. "I'm gonna need you to step aside," he snapped, louder this time, drawing more eyes. "You're causing trouble and I don't have time for it." The accusation hung heavy, baseless but deliberate, a jab meant to provoke. A murmur rolled through the onlookers, some shifting uncomfortably, others craning their necks for a better view. The woman tilted her head slightly, a faint crease forming between her brows, but her voice stayed cool as ice. "I'm not causing anything. I'm waiting to board, same as everyone else." She reached into her briefcase, slow and deliberate. and pulled out a boarding pass, holding it out like a shield. "Here, check it if you need to." He snatched it from her hand, his fingers brushing hers with a roughness he didn't bother to hide. The paper crinkled as he scanned it, his lips curling into a sneer. Lorraine Carter, Seat 2A, First Class. His eyes flicked up to her, then back to the pass, searching for a flaw, a reason to push harder. First class, of course. The knot in his gut tightened. "Entitled types," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear, his tone dripping with venom. He didn't care if she caught it. Part of him wanted her to. Around them the crowd thickened, passengers pausing mid-step, their curiosity outweighing their haste. A young guy in a hoodie pulled out his phone, angling it toward the scene, the faint click of a recording starting up. Victor didn't notice, too locked in on Lorraine, his coffee-fueled nerves sparking into something uglier. "Everything okay here?" A voice cut in, soft but firm. Tara, the gate agent, stepped up beside Victor, her round face flushed with unease. She was 24, fresh out of training, her blonde ponytail bobbing as she glanced between them. Her badge glinted under the fluorescent lights, a shiny counterpoint to Victor's scowl. "She's cleared," Tara said, her words clipped, a plea wrapped in professionalism. "Let it go, Vic." She leaned closer, dropping her voice. "We're already behind." Victor shot her a look, his hazel eyes narrowing, but he didn't budge. "I'm handling it," he growled, waving her off like she was a fly. Tara hesitated, then retreated to the desk, her fingers tapping nervously on the counter. Lorraine stood her ground, her briefcase now resting against her leg, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. She didn't raise her voice, didn't snap back, but her stillness carried weight, a quiet defiance that gnawed at Victor's pride. He thrust the boarding pass back at her, the paper flapping in the air between them. "Fine, move it," he barked, stepping aside just enough for her to pass. She took it without a word, her fingers steady, and rejoined the line, her stride smooth and unhurried. Victor watched her go, his pulse thudding in his ears, a mix of triumph and irritation swirling in his chest. He'd won, hadn't he? Pushed, her back in line, asserted his turf. But the way she carried herself, like his little power play hadn't touched her, stuck in his craw. What Victor didn't know, couldn't know, was that Lorraine Carter wasn't just another passenger. At 47, she'd climbed from a junior compliance officer auditing dusty airstrips in rural Ohio to the pinnacle of aviation oversight. 3 months ago, she'd been sworn in as the chief regulator of the Federal Aviation Administration, a title that made her one of the most powerful figures in American air travel. She oversaw safety protocols, airline compliance, and the tangled web of regulations that kept millions airborne daily. Today she was traveling incognito, her badge tucked deep in her briefcase, her mission simple: observe United's operations firsthand, unfiltered by the polish of announced inspections. Victor's outburst was already a black mark in her mental ledger, a flare of prejudice she'd dissect later. For now, she let him stew in his ignorance, his smugness a ticking bomb he didn't even see. The boarding line crept forward, passengers shuffling onto the jet bridge, their murmurs fading into the terminal's white noise. Victor turned away, brushing past Tara without a glance, his mind already spinning excuses. He'd handled it, kept order, done his job. That's what he told himself as he grabbed his clipboard, flipping through the manifest with a flick of his wrist. But the unease lingered, a faint itch at the back of his neck, like he'd missed something big. He shook it off, chalking it up to exhaustion, the delay, the grind of the morning rush. The woman in the gray suit was just another face, another annoyance in a long day. He had no clue she held the power to unravel his entire world, that her calm exterior masked a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Lorraine, meanwhile, stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool metal walls closing around her as she moved toward the plane. She adjusted her briefcase strap, her mind racing despite her outward calm. Victor's hostility wasn't new to her, not after decades navigating a career where her race and gender often made her a target. She'd faced worse, from snide comments in boardrooms to outright sabotage on field audits. But this was personal, a public jab that stung deeper than she'd admit. She'd expected professionalism, not a petty power trip laced with venom. As she neared the aircraft door, she glanced back through the glass partition, catching Victor's silhouette against the gate's harsh lights. He was barking at another passenger now, his strut intact. She filed it away, a detail for her report. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Victor had lit the match, and the fire was coming. The jet bridge hummed with the shuffle of feet, the air thick with recycled coolness, and the faint tang of jet fuel seeping through the seams. Lorraine's heels clicked softly, each step a metronome to her thoughts. She'd planned this trip to Seattle as a routine check, a chance to see United's crew in action without the filter of corporate spin. Victor's move had turned it into something else, a test of how deep the rot ran. She didn't know his name yet, hadn't caught the glint of his tag in the chaos. But she'd find out, she always did. And when she did, he'd learn that crossing her wasn't just a mistake, it was a career ender. For now, she kept her head high, her face a blank slate, letting him think he'd won. The real clash was still ahead, and Victor Hensley had no idea what he'd just unleashed. Lorraine Carter stepped off the jet bridge into the sleek cabin of United Airlines Flight 632, the faint hum of the aircraft's engines vibrating beneath her feet. The first-class section greeted her with plush leather seats and a soft glow from overhead lights, a stark contrast to the terminal's fluorescent glare. She slid her briefcase into the compartment above seat 2A, her fingers lingering on the worn leather as she settled in. The confrontation with Victor Hensley still simmered in her chest, a low burn of indignation she tamped down with practice. She dodged his petty power play thanks to Tara's intervention, and now she was aboard, mission intact. Wasn't that a win? She exhaled, smoothing her gray suit jacket, convincing herself the worst was behind her. This trip to Seattle was about observation, not escalation, and she'd keep it that way. For now. The cabin filled slowly, passengers trickling in with the usual mix of exhaustion and impatience. A flight attendant with a tight bun and a forced smile offered Lorraine a glass of water, which she accepted with a polite nod. She pulled out her tablet, its screen casting a faint blue glow as she opened a blank document. Victor's behavior was already a bullet point in her mind. Unprovoked hostility, clear bias, a breach of professionalism. As chief regulator of the Federal Aviation Administration, she'd seen plenty of cracks in airline operations, but this was personal. She tapped out notes, her fingers moving with quiet precision, each word a brick in the case she'd build later. The plane jolted slightly as it pushed back from the gate, the captain's voice crackling over the intercom with a clipped, "We're cleared for takeoff, folks. Flight time to Seattle, 2 hours 50 minutes. Lorraine glanced out the window, the tarmac sliding past in a blur of gray and yellow lines. She'd won this round, hadn't she? Mid-flight, the cabin settled into a rhythmic hum, the drone of engines blending with the soft clatter of drink carts. Lorraine sipped her water, her eyes drifting from her tablet to the crew bustling in the aisle. Victor emerged from the galley, his wiry frame unmistakable even in the dim light. He moved with that same strut, clipboard in hand, his voice carrying as he leaned toward a colleague, a stocky guy with a buzz cut. "Some of these pushy passengers think they own the plane," Victor said, loud enough to cut through the cabin's murmur, "especially the ones who don't belong up here." His colleague chuckled, a low grunt of agreement, and Lorraine's grip tightened on her glass. The jab was aimed at her, no question, laced with a venom that prickled her skin. She'd heard, worse over the years, slurs whispered in break rooms, assumptions spat across conference tables. But this was bold, reckless. Did he think she wouldn't notice? She added it to her notes, racial undertones, crew complicity. Evidence was stacking up, and she felt a flicker of triumph. She'd bury him with this later. Victor's eyes swept the cabin, landing on her, like a hawk spotting prey. She didn't flinch, just kept tapping on her tablet, her face a mask of indifference. He froze for a split second, then stalked toward her, his boots thudding against the carpeted floor. "Ma'am," he said, his voice sharp, a blade wrapped in fake courtesy. "What are you writing there? Looks suspicious." The word hung, heavy, a challenge dressed as concern. Lorraine looked up, meeting his gaze with a cool stare that could have frosted glass. "It's private," she replied, her tone flat, unyielding. "I'm not breaking any rules." Victor's lips twitched, a sneer tugging at the corners, but he had no ground to stand on. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, a businessman in row 3 glancing over with a furrowed brow. Victor hovered, his shadow looming over her, then muttered something under his breath, too low to catch, and retreated to the galley. Lorraine's pulse steadied. Another dodge, another point in her favor. Could she keep this up all the way to Seattle? The rest of the flight passed in a tense quiet, the cabin lights dimming as the plane sliced through the clouds. Lorraine finished. Her notes, her tablet now a loaded weapon she'd wheeled back in D.C. Victor stayed out of sight, likely stewing in the rear, his ego bruised but not broken. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, the hum of the engines lulling her into a false calm. She'd handled him, kept her cover, gathered intel. This was what she did, wasn't it? Outlast the noise, turn it into leverage. The landing gear whirred as the plane touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International, a smooth jolt that snapped her upright. She gathered her things, her briefcase a familiar weight against her shoulder, and joined the deboarding line. The air outside was crisp, tinged with the salt of Puget Sound, and she breathed it in, feeling the weight of Chicago lift. She'd made it through, or so she thought. As Lorraine stepped into the gate area, the terminal's chaos swallowed her, a swirl of voices and footsteps echoing off high ceilings. She adjusted her jacket, ready to slip away unnoticed, her mind already on the hotel and the next day's meetings. Then a crackle split the air, Victor's voice barking over the radio from the jet bridge. "Yeah, we had a problem passenger in first class," he said, his tone clipped, dripping with malice. "Threatened crew safety, acted real aggressive. Better flag her." Lorraine froze, her blood turning cold. Passengers streamed past, oblivious, but she caught the words like a slap. He was lying, spinning a tale to cover his tracks, and it was working. Before she could react, 3 airport security officers closed in, their navy uniforms stark against the crowd. The leader, a broad-shouldered guy with a buzz cut and a badge reading Jenkins, stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," he said, his voice gruff, no room for debate. Lorraine's stomach dropped, but she kept her face steady, her years of training kicking in. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone calm, probing. Jenkins nodded toward the jet bridge where Victor lingered, his smirk barely hidden. "Report of a disturbance. You're detained until we sort it out." The other 2 officers flanked her, their boots scuffing the floor, and she felt the weight of a dozen stares. A woman with a stroller slowed, whispering to her husband. "A kid pointed, wide-eyed. Lorraine's briefcase hung heavy in her grip as Jenkins gestured for her to move. "Let's go," he said, sharper now, and she complied, her heels clicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Handcuffs clicked around her wrists, cold metal biting into her skin, and the terminal blurred into a haze of shock. What had Victor just done? The officers marched her through the gate area, past the check-in desks, and into a narrow hallway lined with gray doors. Her mind raced, piecing it together. Victor hadn't let it go, hadn't swallowed his pride. He'd escalated, turned, a nothing clash into a full-blown accusation, and now she was in cuffs. She'd underestimated him, assumed his bluster was all bark. How could she have missed this? They shoved her into a small holding room, a concrete box with a single metal chair and a flickering bulb overhead. Jenkins tossed her briefcase onto a table, its contents spilling out, her tablet skittering across the surface. "Sit," he ordered, and she did, her back straight, her eyes locked on him. The door slammed shut, leaving her alone with the hum of the vent and the echo of her own breathing. She dodged his first swing, but this was a knockout punch she hadn't seen coming. Lorraine sat there, the cuffs chafing her wrists, her mind a storm of fury and strategy. She'd been here before, in a way, cornered by men who saw her skin before her title, her presence as a threat before a person. But this was different, public, calculated. Victor's lie had teeth and it was sinking in fast. She replayed the flight, his words, his sneer, searching for a misstep she could have caught. Had she pushed him too far by staying calm? The door creaked open. Jenkins back with a notepad, his pen tapping a staccato beat. "You want to explain why a flight attendant says you threatened him?" he asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. Lorraine took a breath, steadying herself. "He's lying," she said, her voice ablade. "I'm Lorraine Carter, FAA Chief Regulator. Check my credentials. This is retaliation." Jenkins snorted, flipping through her spilled papers, but he didn't look convinced. The trap was set, and she was caught. For now. "Hey folks, what do you think about Victor's move here?" Comment number 1, if you're raging at how he twisted the truth, to frame Lorraine, or drop your own take below. Ever seen someone's ego turn a small clash into a massive mess? Hit that like button if you're hooked on this wild ride. And subscribe to catch every twist as Lorraine fights back against this injustice. Imagine you're in her shoes, cuffed for no reason, your whole career on the line. How far would you go to clear your name? So what's next for Lorraine? She's got her FAA title as a lifeline, but will it pull her out of this pit? Or has Victor's lie already dug her grave too deep? Stick around to find out. The holding room at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was a claustrophobic cube of gray concrete, its air stale and thick with the tang of industrial cleaner. Lorraine Carter sat bolted to a metal chair, her wrists still locked in handcuffs that pinched her skin with every slight shift. Her gray suit, once pristine, now bore faint creases from the scuffle, and her leather briefcase lay gutted on the table, its contents strewn like a crime scene. Tablet, pens, a crumpled notepad, her FAA badge glinting under the flickering bulb. She kept her spine straight, her dark eyes fixed on the door, a storm of fury and calculation brewing behind her calm facade. Victor Hensley's lie had landed her here, his radioed smear morphing a petty clash into a full-blown detention. She'd told Jenkins she was the FAA Chief Regulator, flashed her credentials, but the clock on the wall ticked past 30 minutes with no response. What was taking so long? The door swung open, hinges squealing, and Jenkins lumbered back in, his broad frame filling the threshold. Behind him loomed Randall Pierce, a grizzled ex-cop turned airport security chief, his face a map of deep lines and a permanent scowl. At 55, Randall carried the bulk of a man who'd traded beat patrols for desk duty, his Navy uniform straining at the shoulders. His badge gleamed, a silver star pinned to his chest, and his pale blue eyes locked onto Lorraine with a cold, appraising stare. Jenkins dropped her badge onto the table with a clatter, stepping back as Randall took the lead. "So," Randall drawled, his voice gravelly, thick with a southern twang, "you're claiming you're some big shot with the FAA, that right?" Lorraine nodded, her tone steady as steel. "Lorraine Carter, Chief Regulator. My ID proves it. This is a mistake, and I need to be released now." Randall picked up the badge, turning it over in his thick fingers, his lips curling into a sneer. "Anyone can fake credentials," he said, tossing it back onto the table like it was trash. "Heard a lot of stories in my time, lady. Yours ain't special." He leaned in, resting his knuckles on the table, his breath sour with coffee and tobacco. "Flight attendant says you threatened crew safety. That's serious. We don't let just anyone waltz through here, badge or no badge." Lorraine's pulse spiked, but she kept her face a mask. "He's lying," she said, each word deliberate. "I've done nothing wrong. Call my office in DC. Verify it." Randall chuckled, a low guttural sound that echoed off the walls. "Oh, we'll get to that eventually." He straightened, folding his arms, his bulk casting a shadow over her. Jenkins shifted uneasily behind him, his buzz cut catching the light as he scribbled on his notepad. "She's got a clean record," he muttered, almost to himself. But Randall shot him a look that could have cracked stone. "Don't mean squat," Randall snapped. "Victor Hensley's a good kid, known him years. He says she's trouble. I believe him." Lorraine's stomach twisted. Years? This wasn't random. Randall and Victor were connected, an old boys' network flexing its muscle. She'd seen it before, cops and crew covering each other's backs, but now it was her in the crosshairs. "You're taking his word over evidence?" she asked, her voice cutting through the room. That's not protocol. Randall's scowl deepened, his eyes narrowing to slits. I decide what's protocol here, he growled, and turned to Jenkins. Keep her locked down. I'll handle the rest. Hours dragged by, the clock's hands crawling past 2, then 3. Lorraine sat in silence, her mind racing, plotting her next move. She'd been detained before, once during a protest in her 20s, but this was different, a calculated trap. Victor's lie was the spark, but Randall was the fuel, fanning it into something bigger. She flexed her fingers, the cuffs biting deeper, and replayed the flight. Victor's sneer, his muttered slurs, his radioed betrayal. She'd assumed he'd back off after Tara's nudge, but he'd doubled down, weaponizing his word against her skin. Why hadn't she seen it coming? The door opened again, a junior officer slipping in, a skinny kid with nervous hands and a badge reading, Owens. He glanced at her, then at the table, his voice low. DC's on the line. They confirmed her. FAA chief, we gotta let her go. Lorraine's chest loosened, a flicker of relief cutting through the tension. Owens fumbled with a key, unlocking her cuffs as he muttered, Sorry about this, ma'am. The metal fell away, leaving red welts on her wrists, and she rubbed them, standing to gather her things. She'd beaten this, hadn't she? Her badge was real, her title verified. She slid it into her pocket, her tablet back in her briefcase, ready to walk out and dismantle Victor's lie from the top down. But Randall stormed back in, his face a thundercloud, his boots slamming the floor. Where's her badge? He barked, glaring at Owens. The kid blinked, confused. She just had it, he stammered, pointing to her pocket. Randall's hand shot out, snatching the badge before Lorraine could react, his fingers brushing her jacket with deliberate force. Looks like she's resisting, Randall said, his voice loud, performative, as he shoved the badge into his own pocket. Lorraine's jaw dropped, shock flooding her system. What are you doing? She demanded, stepping back as Jenkins moved in, his notepad forgotten. You're free to go, Randall said, his sneer twisting into something uglier. But now you've got an attitude problem, resisting arrest. That's a new charge. He nodded to Jenkins, who grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back as fresh cuffs snapped on. Lorraine's breath caught, her briefcase tumbling to the floor, papers scattering like leaves. This is illegal, she said, her voice rising, sharp with fury. You've got no grounds. Randall leaned close, his tobacco breath hot on her face. Got all the grounds I need, he hissed. Victor said you're a troublemaker, and I'm making sure you don't fly anywhere soon. The room spun as Jenkins hauled her out, Owens trailing behind, his face pale with guilt. They marched her through a back corridor, past locked doors and flickering exit signs, the terminal's bustle a distant hum. Her mind raced, grappling with the betrayal. She'd shown her badge, proven her identity, and still they'd turned on her. Randall's smirk, his pocketed theft, his baseless charge. It was a setup, a power play rooted in the same venom Victor had spat. Her race, her poise, her authority, they couldn't stomach it, so they'd rigged the game. She stumbled as Jenkins shoved her into a van, its engine rumbling, and the door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. The vehicle lurched forward, tires squealing, and she braced herself against the wall, her wrists throbbing under the cuffs. Minutes bled into an hour, the van weaving through Seattle streets, the faint wail of sirens threading through the roar of traffic. Lorraine's stomach churned, but she forced her breathing steady, her years of crisis management kicking in. She'd get out, expose this, bring the FAA's weight down on them all. The van stopped, brakes screeching, and the door slid open, revealing a precinct lot bathed in sodium light. Jenkins yanked her out, his grip bruising, and marched her into a squat brick building, its lobby buzzing with cops and flickering fluorescence. They booked her, fingerprints smudging ink onto her hands, her mugshot flashing on a screen. Lorraine Carter, resisting arrest. She stood tall, her gray suit rumpled but her eyes blazing as they shoved her into a cell, the bars clanging shut. The cell was a dank hole, its walls streaked with grime. A single bench bolted to the floor. Lorraine sat, her briefcase confiscated, her phone gone, her badge in Randall's pocket. She'd been so close to freedom, her identity confirmed, Owens unlocking her cuffs. Then Randall had flipped it, a sleight of hand that turned victory into a deeper trap. She rubbed her wrists, the welts pulsing, and pieced it together. Victor had called ahead, primed Randall, his old pal, to teach her a lesson. This wasn't just prejudice, it was a conspiracy, a system flexing its claws to keep her down. She'd faced bias before, audits stalled, promotions delayed. But this was raw, vicious, a public stripping of her power. Hours ticked by, the cell's chill seeping into her bones. She leaned against the wall, her mind a whirlwind of plans. She'd call her deputy in D.C., file charges, drag Randall and Victor into the light. She'd won the first round on the plane, kept her cool, gathered ammo. Now they'd escalated, but she'd fight back harder. The precinct hummed beyond the bars, phones ringing, voices barking, and she waited, her resolve hardening. Randall thought he'd caged her, silenced her, but he'd misjudged. She was Lorraine Carter, FAA chief, and this wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Let them gloat. They'd see soon enough. The cell door clanged open at dawn, a bleary-eyed guard tossing Lorraine Carter's confiscated briefcase onto the bench beside her. She'd spent the night in that dank Seattle precinct, her gray suit now a map of wrinkles, her wrists still, raw from the cuffs. Her lawyer, a wiry man named Marcus Tate with a shaved head and a voice like a bullhorn, had pulled strings to get her bailed out. She stood smoothing her jacket with stiff fingers and grabbed the briefcase, its leather cool against her palm. The guard muttered, "You're free to go." But his tone carried a grudge, a leftover echo of Randall Pierce's venom. Lorraine stepped into the precinct lobby, the air thick with coffee fumes and the clatter of keyboards, and met Marcus's sharp gaze. "We're going straight to court," he said, his words clipped, urgent. "This ends today." The drive to the King County Courthouse was a blur of rain-slicked streets and gray skies, Seattle's drizzle smearing the van's windows. Lorraine sat in the back, her mind a steel trap, replaying the last 12 hours. Victor's lie, Randall's frame-up, the cold cell. She'd called Marcus from a precinct phone, briefing him in hushed tones, and he'd mobilized fast, pulling flight logs, passenger statements, even Owens's reluctant testimony. Now, at 8:30 a.m., they rolled into the courthouse lot, a squat stone building flanked by dripping evergreens. Lorraine adjusted her suit, her heels clicking on wet pavement as Marcus led her inside. The courtroom loomed ahead, its wooden benches packed with reporters, airline reps, and curious locals, a buzzing hive of anticipation. She took her seat at the defendant's table, her briefcase a shield, and felt the weight of 100 eyes. Judge Evelyn Harper presided, a wiry woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and a stare that could cut glass. Her black robe rustled as she banged her gavel, silencing the room's hum. "Case of Lorraine Carter versus Seattle-Tacoma Airport Authority and United Airlines," she announced, her voice a steady drumbeat. "Charges, resisting arrest. Let's hear it." Marcus stood, his suit crisp, his presence filling the space. "Your Honor, my client was falsely detained and charged based on a fabricated report from a United flight attendant, Victor Hensley, and a complicit security chief, Randall Pierce. We have evidence to prove it." He laid out the case with surgical precision, flight logs showing no disturbance, Owen's statement confirming her FAA status, a grainy passenger video of Victor's gate rant. Lorraine watched, her pulse steady, as the room leaned forward, hooked. The prosecution, a slick attorney in a pinstripe suit named Greg Vance, countered with a smirk. "Ms. Carter resisted lawful detention," he said, his voice oily, confident. "Security acted on credible threats reported by Mr. Hensley, a 10-year veteran. She escalated the situation." He flashed a photo of her spilled briefcase, spinning it as evidence of defiance. Lorraine's jaw tightened, but Marcus pounced, presenting a time-stamped call log proving her DC verification before Randall's resisting claim. "This was retaliation," Marcus boomed, pointing to the gallery where Victor sat, his wiry frame hunched, eyes darting. A racist lie turned into a frame-up. Judge Harper's brow furrowed, her pen scratching notes. and Lorraine felt a spark of hope. Was this her way out? The hearing stretched into hours, testimony piling up like bricks. Owens took the stand, his skinny frame trembling as he admitted, "I unlocked her cuffs after DC confirmed her." Then Pierce took over. A passenger, a middle-aged woman with a shaky voice, described Victor's pushy passenger rant mid-flight. Vance floundered, his objections overruled, his narrative crumbling. Lorraine testified last, her voice clear, unshaken, recounting every detail. Victor's gate aggression, Randall's badge theft, the cuffs snapping back on. "I'm the FAA chief regulator," she said, locking eyes with Harper. "They targeted me for no reason but prejudice." The room buzzed, reporters scribbling, and Victor shifted in his seat, his smirk gone, replaced by a twitch of panic. At noon, Judge Harper delivered her ruling, her gavel a thunderclap. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said, her tone sharp, final. "Charges dismissed. This court finds gross misconduct by United Airlines and airport security. Ms. Carter is free, and I recommend disciplinary action." The gallery erupted, gasps and murmurs rippling through the crowd. Lorraine exhaled, her shoulders loosening as Marcus clapped her back, his grin wide. "We did it," he whispered, and she nodded, relief flooding her veins. She'd beaten them, turned their trap into a public win. Victor's suspension was imminent, Randall's career teetered, and she'd walk out with her name intact. She stood, gathering her briefcase ready to leave this nightmare behind. But as she stepped into the courthouse lobby, the air shifted, thick with a new menace. A crowd had gathered outside, spilling onto the steps, their voices a rising growl. United loyalists, egged on by Victor's whispered lies from the gallery, formed a wall of snarling faces. Men in trucker hats, women clutching purses, their eyes wild with fury. "Troublemaker," one shouted, his voice hoarse, accusing. "You don't belong here," another spat, her words a venomous hiss. Lorraine froze, her briefcase heavy in her hand, as Marcus flanked her, his grin fading. The mob pressed closer, a sea of pale faces twisted with hate, their chants growing. Louder, uglier. "Go back where you came from," a burly guy bellowed, his fist clenched, and the racial edge cut deep. A blade she'd felt too many times before. She scanned the crowd, spotting Victor near the edge, his wiry frame hunched, but his eyes glinting with malice. He'd lost in court, but he'd lit this fuse, rallied these bigots to hit her where the law couldn't. Police lingered at the perimeter, their arms crossed, smirks tugging at their lips. No move to intervene. Lorraine's chest tightened, her victory souring fast. She'd beaten the system inside, hadn't she? Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the side exit, but the mob surged, blocking their path. "Get her!" a voice screamed, and the air cracked as a brick sailed past her head, smashing a courthouse window into a spiderweb of glass. Shards tinkled to the ground, and Lorraine ducked, her briefcase slipping, her breath catching. The crowd roared, feeding, off the chaos, their hatred a living thing. Another projectile, a bottle this time, spun through the air, narrowly missing Marcus as he shoved Lorraine behind him. "We need to move," he yelled, his voice barely cutting through the din. She stumbled, her heels skidding on the steps, her mind racing. This wasn't just anger, it was a lynching in slow motion, a backlash fueled by the same poison Victor had spat at the gate. She'd won in court, exposed their lies, but they'd turned it into a war. A man lunged, his fist swinging, and Marcus blocked it, grunting as they tussled. Lorraine regained her footing, clutching her briefcase like a lifeline, and bolted for a gap in the mob, her heart pounding. Police finally stirred, lazily forming a loose line, their batons tapping against their thighs. "Break it up," one shouted, half-hearted, his eyes sliding past Lorraine with indifference. She pushed through, Marcus at her side, the crowd's jeers a deafening wave. "FAA fraud! You'll pay for this!" Her suit tore at the sleeve, snagged by clawing hands, and she tasted bile, the sting of betrayal sharp. Victor had orchestrated this, a vendetta to claw back his power, and the cops let it happen. She broke free, reaching the lot where their van idled and scrambled inside, Marcus slamming the door as fists pounded the metal. The driver peeled out, tires screeching, and the mob's roar faded into the rain. Lorraine slumped against the seat, her chest heaving, her briefcase clutched to her lap. Blood trickled from a shallow cut on her hand, glass or a nail, she couldn't tell. Marcus panted beside her, his shirt rumpled, his knuckles red. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, but her mind spun. She'd beaten the charges, walked out with justice, only to face this, a mob ready to tear her apart. Victor's smirk flashed in her memory, his rally cry echoing in their slurs. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. She'd humiliated him, and now he'd unleashed hell. The van sped toward safety, but the courthouse steps burned in her mind, a warning of worse to come. She wiped the blood on her sleeve, her resolve hardening. She'd won the legal battle, exposed their rot, but they'd hit back with fists and bricks, a raw, racist fury she couldn't ignore. This wasn't over. It was a new front, and she'd fight it with everything she had. Victor thought he'd broken her, turned her victory into chaos, but he'd miscalculated. She was Lorraine Carter, FAA chief, and she'd bury him yet. The van's engine growled, carrying her away, but the war was just beginning. Lorraine Carter slumped in the back of the van, her torn sleeve brushing against the cracked leather seat as the engine growled through Seattle's rain-soaked streets. The courthouse mob's roars still echoed in her ears, their slurs and fists, a brutal punctuation to her courtroom win. Her hand throbbed, the shallow cut oozing a thin line of blood she wiped on her skirt, staining the gray fabric. Marcus Tate, her lawyer, sat beside her, his knuckles bruised from blocking that wild swing, his breathing heavy but steady. The driver, a quiet guy with a buzz cut, kept his eyes on the road, weaving through traffic toward a downtown hotel where Lorraine could regroup. She clutched her briefcase, its leather scuffed from the chaos, and felt the weight of Victor Hensley's vendetta settled deep in her bones. She'd beaten his lie in court, hadn't she? So why did this feel like a loss? By noon, she was back in D.C., the hotel pit stop a blur of hot showers and a fresh suit. Black this time, sharp as a blade. Marcus had arranged a private jet, pulling FAA strings to get her home fast, away from Seattle's simmering hate. She landed at Dulles International, the tarmac slick with late March drizzle, and strode into FAA headquarters, a glass and steel fortress overlooking the Potomac. Her office on the 10th floor smelled of coffee and paper, a sanctuary of order after the storm. Her team, a mix of analysts and deputies, greeted her with tense nods, their faces tight with worry. "Heard about the courthouse," her deputy, Carla Nguyen, said, her voice low, urgent. "You okay?" Lorraine forced a smile, setting her briefcase on the desk. "I'm fine. Let's hit back." She filed a formal FAA complaint against United Airlines that afternoon, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she detailed Victor's gate aggression, his mid-flight slurs, the false radio report, and Randall's precinct frame-up. The document was a weapon, 40 pages of cold facts backed by flight logs, Owens's testimony, and Judge Harper's ruling. She attached a grainy still from a passenger's video, Victor's sneer frozen mid-rant, and hit send, the email pinging to United's legal team and the FAA's oversight board. By dusk, news broke. United suspended Victor pending investigation, his 10-year tenure dangling by a thread. Headlines blared her triumph. FAA chief targeted in airline scandal. And Lorraine felt momentum shift. She briefed her team, their laptops glowing in the dim conference room, and laid out plans for a broader audit. "This isn't just one man," she said, her voice firm. "It's a system. We're tearing it open." For 2 days, she rode the wave, fielding calls from reporters, drafting statements, her office a hive of activity. United's stock dipped 3 points, a public bruise, and whispers of Randall's resignation swirled. Lorraine stood at her window, the Potomac a silver ribbon below, and let herself believe she'd turned the tide. Victor was down, the mob's fury contained, her name cleared. Wasn't this justice? But across town, in a penthouse suite atop United's corporate tower, Gerald Maddox had other plans. The CEO, a silver-haired titan at 62, paced his office, his tailored suit pristine despite the late hour. His face, tanned from golf courses and private jets, twisted with rage as he scrolled the headlines on his tablet, each one a dagger to his empire's image. Gerald wasn't just a suit. He was a kingmaker, with senators on speed dial and a fortune built on airline mergers. Victor Hensley was small fry, a pawn, but Lorraine's complaint threatened the boardroom, not just the gate. He'd met Victor, once years back, at a crew appreciation event, shaking his hand over lukewarm beers. Now, that wiry flight attendant was his ticket to flip this mess. Gerald summoned him that night, a black SUV whisking Victor from his cramped apartment to the tower's private elevator. Victor stepped in, his uniform swapped for a wrinkled polo, his eyes darting with nervous energy. "You're reinstated," Gerald said, his voice smooth, commanding as he poured 2 scotches from a crystal decanter. "And you're gonna help me bury her." Victor blinked, his smirk faltering then spreading. "She humiliated me," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm in." Gerald laid out the plan, simple and vicious, a smear campaign to flip the script. By morning, fake news hit the wires, seeded by Gerald's PR machine. "FAA chief caught in corruption sting," one screamed, claiming Lorraine extorted airlines for kickbacks. Another, "Regulator targets United in personal vendetta," painted her as a power-hungry fraud. No proof, just noise, but it spread like wildfire, blogs and forums amplifying the lies. Lorraine woke to her phone buzzing, texts from Carla flooding in. "Check X, it's bad." She opened the app, her stomach dropping as death threats piled up. "You'll pay, liar. Step down or else." Each laced with racial venom that stung like acid. She raced to the office, the DC streets a gray blur, and found her team in chaos, phones ringing off the hook. Her window, a 10th floor beacon, was shattered, glass crunching underfoot. Racial slurs spray-painted across the wall and dripping. Red, "Go back." Her breath caught, the mob's hate following her cross-country, now corporate-sized. She called security, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, and swept the glass aside, rallying her deputies. "This is United hitting back," she said, her eyes blazing. "We stand firm." But the war escalated that night when Gerald leaked doctored footage to a tabloid site. The video, grainy and spliced, showed Lorraine on the flight, her tablet raised, Victor cowering, her voice dubbed with a snarling, "Back off or I'll ruin you." A lie, pure fiction, but it went viral, racking up 2 million views by dawn. Public opinion flipped overnight, the headlines shifting from her triumph to her tyranny. Protesters gathered outside FAA headquarters, a smaller echo of Seattle's, mob chanting, "Resign, fraud." Lorraine watched from her cracked window, her black suit a stark silhouette against the chaos. She'd filed the complaint, forced United's hand, felt the rush of victory. Now this, a corporate dagger twisting the narrative, making her the villain. Her team dug into the footage, spotting the edits, the audio mismatch, but the damage was done. Gerald's machine had teeth and Victor was his sharpened edge. She sat at her desk, the spray paint's stench lingering, and traced the red letters with her finger. How had it flipped so fast? Victor, reinstated with a fat bonus, strutted through United's training center, his suspension erased like it never happened. Gerald's cash lined his pockets, and the footage's fallout fueled his grin. He'd lost in court, taken the hit. But this was better. A public gut punch to Lorraine. He scrolled X on his break, liking posts that called her a crooked regulator, his fingers twitching with glee. Gerald had promised more, a bigger play to crush her, and Victor was all in. Lorraine, meanwhile, stared at her tablet, the fake, video looping, her dubbed voice a stranger's. She'd underestimated United's reach, Gerald's ruthlessness. The complaint had stung them, sure, but this was war, and they'd drawn blood. She stood, brushing glass from her chair, and called Carla over. "Get me everything on Gerald Maddox," she said, her voice a quiet blade. "Financials, connections, dirt. We're hitting back harder." Carla nodded, diving into files, as Lorraine paced, her mind a storm. She'd won in court, survived the mob, thought she'd gained ground. Now United had flipped it, turned her into a pariah, and the threats kept coming, each one a brick through her life's window. She'd fight, expose the forgery, claw her way up. But Gerald wasn't done, and Victor's smirk loomed in her mind, a promise of worse to come. Okay, let's unpack this twist, folks. What do you make of Gerald pulling Victor into this corporate revenge plot? Comment number 1 if you think Lorraine's still got the upper hand despite this smear, or let us know how you'd counter United's dirty tricks. Ever seen a wind turn sour this fast? Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button if you're fired up by this corporate backstab, and subscribe to see Lorraine take on this Goliath. How far would you push back against a lie this big? Now here's the real kicker. Lorraine's ready to dig into Gerald's world, but what happens when the fight gets personal? When the stakes hit closer than ever? Stay tuned to find out. Lorraine Carter stood in her shattered office at FAA headquarters, the Potomac glinting through the jagged hole where her window once sat. The spray-painted slurs, "Go back," dripped red across the wall, a scarlet wound against the beige paint. Glass crunched under her black heels as she paced, her tablet clutched in one hand, the fake video still looping in her mind, her dubbed voice snarling threats she'd never spoken. Gerald Maddox's smear campaign had turned her triumph into a public flogging, and the death threats buzzing her phone were a relentless drumbeat. Quit or die. You don't belong here. She'd faced United's corporate claws, survived the courthouse mob, but this was a new beast, clawing at her name, her life. She set the tablet down, her fingers trembling, and dialed her daughter, Maya, a freshman at Howard University, her voice a lifeline in the storm. "Mama, you okay?" Maya's voice crackled through, bright but edged with worry. At 19, she was a whirlwind of braids and ambition, studying political science, her dorm room a chaos of books and posters. Lorraine forced a calm she didn't feel. "I'm fine, baby. Just checking in. You safe?" Maya laughed, a light sound that eased Lorraine's chest. "Yeah, campus is quiet. Midterms are killing me, though." They chatted, Lorraine clinging to the normalcy, picturing Maya's smile, her quick wit. She'd shielded her from the worst, kept the courthouse riot and United's lies off her radar. "Stay focused," Lorraine said, ending the call, her heart steadying. Maya was safe, untouched by this mess. Wasn't she? By noon, the news broke online, a fresh wound tearing open. Maya's personal details, her dorm address, her class schedule, splashed across a hate forum, doxed by an anonymous account linked to United's smear machine. Lorraine's phone lit up, Carla rushing in, her face pale. "They've got Maya," she said, thrusting her laptop forward, the screen glowing with venom. "FAA brat deserves it. Teach her mama a lesson." Racial slurs peppered the posts, a digital lynching aimed at her child. Lorraine's knees buckled, her briefcase slipping to the floor as she gripped the desk, bile rising in her throat. She'd fought Victor, beaten Gerald's legal games, thought she'd protected her family. Now this, a knife to her heart. Her daughter's life cracked open for the world to claw at. She raced to Howard, the 40-minute drive a blur of honking horns and red lights, her black suit sticking to her skin with cold sweat. She found Maya in her dorm, the room a wreck, windows smashed. "Get out," scrawled in black marker across the walls. Maya stood amid the debris, her braids loose, her eyes wide with shock, a baseball bat trembling in her hands. "They came an hour ago," she whispered, dropping the bat as Lorraine pulled her into a crushing hug. Glass littered the floor, books torn, a photo of them at Maya's graduation shredded. Lorraine's chest heaved, rage and guilt warring inside her. She'd won in court, pushed the FAA complaint, thought she'd shielded her girl. How had it come to this? She pulled Maya out, campus security trailing with useless apologies, and drove her to a safe house, a nondescript condo in Arlington rented under Marcus's name. The place was bare, white walls and stiff furniture, a fortress against the chaos. Maya slumped on the couch, her bravado gone, replaced by a quiet tremble Lorraine hadn't seen since she was a kid. "Why me, Mama?" she asked, her voice small, cracking. Lorraine knelt, cupping her face, her own eyes burning. "Because they can't break me, so they're hitting you. I'm so sorry." She'd kept Maya in the dark, thinking it'd spare her, but Gerald's machine had found her anyway, turned her dorm into a battlefield. She enrolled Maya in online classes, pulling her from Howard, her safety now a cage. Lorraine thought she'd locked it down, secured her daughter, turned the safe house into a bunker. She returned to D.C., her focus razor sharp, digging into Gerald's finances with Carla, hunting for cracks to widen. But Victor Hensley, fueled by Gerald's cash and a thirst for revenge, had other plans. He hired a private investigator, a slimy ex-cop named Eddie Voss, with a rap sheet scrubbed clean by moneyed favors. Eddie tailed Lorraine, his rusted sedan blending into DC's traffic, snapping photos of her every move. She didn't notice, too buried in work, her mind on Maya's safety and United's downfall. Eddie struck late, breaking into her Georgetown brownstone under a moonless sky, his gloved hands silent as he planted bugs in her lamps. Her phone, her smoke detectors. He didn't stop there. Eddie rifled her desk, stealing FAA files, memos on United's safety violations, her handwritten notes from the flight. He slipped out, leaving no trace but a faint whiff of cigarette smoke, and delivered the haul to Victor at a dive bar off 14th Street. Victor grinned, flipping through the papers, his wiry frame buzzing with glee. "She's done," he muttered, pocketing the files, Gerald's bonus burning a hole in his jeans. Lorraine came home at dawn, exhausted, her black suit rumpled, and sensed something off, a drawer ajar, a chair shifted. She swept the house, her pulse spiking as she found a bug in her bedside lamp, its tiny red light winking. She crushed it, her heel grinding it into the hardwood, and called Marcus, her voice a hiss. "They've been here." Marcus arrived, his shaved head gleaming under her kitchen lights, and they tore the place apart, finding 5 more bugs, each a stab to her gut. She confronted Eddie days later, tracking him to a gas station after Carla's tech guy traced his burner phone. He leaned against his sedan, a cigarette dangling, his smirk greasy as oil. "Tell me who hired you," she said, her voice low, lethal, her briefcase a prop of authority. Eddie laughed, flicking ash, but crumbled when she flashed FAA credentials and a fake warrant Marcus had mocked up. "Hensley," he spat, his bravado gone. "Paid me $2,000. Lorraine recorded it, her phone hidden in her pocket, and stormed off. The confession, a golden bullet. She exposed Gerald's scheme to the press that night, a live stream from her office, bugs and files displayed, Eddie's words booming. "United's breaking laws to break me," she said, her eyes blazing, and the story exploded. Headlines, flipping back in her favor. She sat back, the press conference's echo fading, thinking she'd landed a knockout blow. Gerald's empire wobbled, Victor's name dragged through the mud. She'd protected Maya, turned their invasion into ammo, regained traction, but Victor wasn't done. He cashed Gerald's last check, a fat $10,000, and leaked Maya's safehouse address to a racist militia group he'd met online, a pack of ex-cons and bigots itching for blood. That night, as Lorraine worked late, a Molotov cocktail sailed through the condo's window, shattering glass and igniting the living room in a roar of flame. Maya screamed, scrambling for the fire extinguisher, her braids swinging as she fought the blaze. Neighbors called 911, sirens wailing, but the militia vanished into the dark, their pickup tires squealing. Lorraine raced to Arlington, her car skidding into the lot as firefighters doused the smoldering ruin. Maya stood outside, wrapped in a blanket, her face streaked with soot, her eyes hollow. "They knew where I was," she whispered, clinging to Lorraine, her body shaking. The condo's front was charred, windows blown out, the stench of gasoline thick in the air. Lorraine's knees buckled, her briefcase forgotten in the car, as she held Maya, guilt crashing over her like a wave. She'd exposed Victor. Thought she'd won this round, locked her daughter away from the hate. Now this. A firebomb through her life, Victor's revenge cutting deeper than ever. Police cordoned the scene, their flashlights slicing the night, but their shrugs told her they'd do nothing. Another layer of the system's rot. She drove Maya to a new hideout, a rural cabin hours from DC, its pine walls a flimsy shield. Lorraine sat up all night, her black suit swapped for jeans, a kitchen knife beside her, watching shadows through the blinds. She'd beaten Gerald's smear, turned Eddie's break-in into a win. But Victor had struck her core, her girl, her reason. The fire's glow burned in her mind, a warning she couldn't shake. She'd underestimated him again. His malice a bottomless well, and now Maya paid the price. She gripped the knife, her resolve steeling. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was survival, and she'd end it, no matter the cost. Lorraine Carter gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the cracked vinyl, as she drove Maya through the pre-dawn gloom to a new safe house. The rural cabin's charred memory lingered, the stench of gasoline and soot clinging to their clothes. Maya sat silent beside her, wrapped in a borrowed coat, her braids tangled, her eyes fixed on the dashboard. The firebomb had shattered their Arlington hideout, Victor Hensley's militia strike a dagger to Lorraine's core. She'd exposed his break-in, turned Eddie's confession into a press win, thought she'd gained ground. Now this, her daughter, trembling, their safety torched. She pulled into a Fairfax motel, a low-slung brick box off the highway, its neon sign buzzing faintly. FAA security met them, 2 agents in dark suits, their faces grim as they ushered them into a room with bolted windows and a steel door. Lorraine exhaled, her jeans stiff with sweat, and tucked Maya into bed, the girl's breathing shallow but steady. She'd protect her, no matter what. By noon, Lorraine was back in D.C., the motel a guarded fortress under FAA watch. She strode into headquarters, her black suit swapped for a navy blazer, her briefcase a weapon reloaded. Carla Nguyen met her in the lobby, her laptop tucked under her arm, her voice urgent. "Congress wants you to testify," she said, handing over a summons, its seal stark against the paper. "Tomorrow. United's mess is blowing up." Lorraine nodded, her jaw tight, and spent the night prepping, her team pulling files on Gerald. Maddox's finances, Victor's militia ties, every scrap of dirt from Eddie's haul. She'd exposed their scheme, turned the tide with the press, but the firebomb had shifted her fight. This wasn't just about her name anymore, it was survival, and she'd take it to the top. The Capitol loomed the next morning, its dome a pale ghost against a slate-gray sky. Lorraine stepped into the hearing room, a cavern of oak and velvet packed with senators, aides, and cameras, the air thick with tension. She took the stand, her navy blazer crisp, her eyes blazing as she swore, her voice steady despite the exhaustion gnawing her bones. Senator Ruth Coleman, a sharp-eyed woman with a silver bob, chaired the session, her gavel a crisp snap. "Ms. Carter," she began, "you've alleged United Airlines and its employees targeted you. Lay it out." Lorraine launched in, her words a barrage. Victor's gate aggression, his false report, Randall's frame-up, Gerald's smear with fake footage, the bugs in her home, the firebomb at Maya's safe house. She stacked evidence on the table, flight logs, Eddie's recorded confession, charred debris from Arlington, each piece a brick in her case. The room buzzed, senators leaning forward, aides scribbling, cameras whirring. Gerald Maddox sat in the witness row, his silver hair gleaming under the lights, his tailored suit a shield of calm. He'd been hauled in, subpoenaed after Lorraine's press strike, and now squirmed as she detailed his financial trails, payments to Victor, hush money to Eddie. "This is a conspiracy," she said, her voice cutting through the hum, "rooted in racial bias, aimed at silencing me and endangering my family." Coleman's brow furrowed, her pen pausing, and Lorraine felt traction, a flicker of triumph. She'd survived the mob, the fire, turned their attacks into ammo. Wasn't this her moment? Victor was arrested mid-hearing, Capitol Police cuffing, him in a side room after Lorraine played Eddie's tape, his voice snarling, "Hensley paid me." The gallery gasped, reporters sprinting for updates, and Gerald's tan paled, his fingers twitching on his tablet. Lorraine watched from the stand, her pulse steadying, as agents detailed Victor's militia chats, threats to burn her out. Senator Coleman banged her gavel, ordering a recess, and Lorraine stepped down, her navy blazer a flag of resilience. She'd laid it bare, forced their hands, and the feds moved fast, raiding United's offices by dusk, seizing servers, Gerald's empire teetering. She returned to the motel that night, Maya asleep under FAA guard, and let herself breathe. She'd Won this round, hadn't she? But Gerald wasn't finished. His lawyers, a pack of silk-tied sharks, worked overnight, bribing Senator Harold Vance, a balding relic with a gambling debt Gerald owned. By morning, Vance stalled the probe, his voice droning in a closed session. "We need more evidence," buying Gerald bail and time. Victor walked too, a technicality springing him from lockup, his smirk intact. Lorraine got the call from Carla at dawn, her voice tight. "They're loose," she said, and Lorraine's stomach dropped, the motel's thin walls closing in. She'd testified, brought Congress down on them, thought she'd caged the beasts. Now this, a bought delay, their claws free again. Victor struck that afternoon, his wiry frame fueled by rage and Gerald's last payout. He ambushed Lorraine at a Fairfax gas station, her car idling as she filled the tank, Maya safe inside with agents. He emerged from a pickup, his polo stained, a switchblade glinting in his hand. "You think you're untouchable?" he snarled, slashing her tires, the rubber hissing as air bled out. He lunged, spitting slurs. "This is for Seattle," his breath sour with beer. Lorraine dodged, her briefcase swinging, catching his jaw with a thud. A crowd gathered, phones flashing, recording as she stumbled back, her navy blazer ripping, at the seam. Victor swung again, the blade nicking her arm, blood blooming on her sleeve, but agents tackled him, pinning him to the gravel as he thrashed, screaming, "She's a fraud!" Lorraine staggered to the car, her arm throbbing, her breath ragged, as police hauled Victor away, his curses fading. The video hit X within hours, a shaky clip of the attack, but twisted by Gerald's PR machine. "FAA chief assaults innocent worker," the caption read, splicing her briefcase swing into a looped aggression, erasing Victor's blade. It racked up views, 3 million by nightfall, and outrage flared. "Resign, Carter!" trending nationwide. She patched her arm in the motel, Maya's eyes wide with fear, and watched the feed, her stomach churning. She'd beaten them in. Congress, forced arrests, thought she'd turned the tide. Now this, a street brawl flipped into her disgrace. The FAA called at midnight, her boss, Director Alan Hayes, his voice a weary sigh over the line. "Lorraine, we're suspending you," he said, the words a punch to her gut. "Pending review. That video's a mess, and the public's screaming." She sat on the motel bed, her navy blazer crumpled beside her, Maya asleep across the room. "It's a lie," she said, her voice cracking, but Hayes cut her off. "I know, but we're drowning in it. Step back. We'll sort it." The line went dead, and she stared at the wall, the hum of the AC filling the silence. She'd testified, exposed their rot, felt the feds close in. How had it flipped so fast? Victor grinned in his cell, released on bail by morning. Gerald's lawyers greasing the wheels. He scrolled X, liking posts that branded Lorraine a thug, his blade erased from the narrative. Gerald, free in his penthouse, sipped scotch, his empire bruised but breathing, the stalled probe a lifeline. Lorraine packed her briefcase, her arm bandaged, her suspension a public shackle. She'd walked into Congress a warrior, come out a victor, only to be ambushed, framed, cast out. The gas station's gravel crunched in her memory, Victor's spit on her face, the crowd's phones a jury of lies. She'd underestimated Gerald's reach, Victor's venom, and now the FAA, her own shield, had turned. She sat beside Maya, the girl's breathing soft, and traced the bandage on her arm, the cut a dull ache. She'd fought for justice, dragged United sins into the light, protected her daughter through fire and hate. Now this, a suspension stripping her power, a video twisting her truth. She'd won the federal stage, forced their arrests, thought she'd broken their spine. But they'd hit back, personal, vicious, a blade to her life. She leaned against the headboard, her resolve flickering but alive. This wasn't the end, it was a pivot, and she'd claw her way up, expose the bribe, dismantle their lies. Victor, and Gerald gloated, free for now, but she'd bury them yet. The motel's shadows stretched long and she waited, her fight far from over. Lorraine Carter sat on the edge of the motel bed in Fairfax, the hum of the air conditioner a low growl against the silence of the early morning. Maya slept fitfully across the room, Her braids splayed across the pillow, her breathing uneven. After the gas station ambush that left Lorraine's arm bandaged and her career suspended, the FAA's call still echoed in her ears, Director Hayes' weary voice stripping her title, her power, all because of a doctored video that turned Victor Hensley's blade into her aggression. Her navy blazer lay crumpled on a chair, stained, with blood and gravel, a relic of her congressional triumph now tainted by Gerald Maddox's lies. She'd fought on the federal stage, exposed their rot, thought she'd caged them. Now this, her daughter hunted, her name smeared, her own agency, turning its back. She clenched her fists, the bandage pulling tight, and decided she'd had enough of playing by their rules. She went rogue that dawn, slipping out of the motel as Maya slept under FAA guard, her jeans and hoodie a shadow against the neon glow. She met two whistleblowers in a dingy diner off Route 50, ex-United IT guys named Jamal and Pete, their faces etched with fatigue and defiance. Jamal, a wiry black man with a shaved head, slid a USB drive across the sticky table, his voice low. "Server logs," he said, tapping it. "Maddox's payoffs, Hensley's militia chats, all unencrypted." Pete, a pale guy with a scruffy beard, nodded, his laptop glowing with hacked emails. "They thought we'd stay quiet," he muttered. "Not after Seattle." Lorraine pocketed the drive, her pulse quickening, and laid out her plan. Crack United's defenses, leak it raw, turn their own dirt against them. She'd been suspended, ambushed, pushed to the edge, but she'd hit back harder. They worked through the night, holed up in a basement apartment Jamal owned in Anacostia, its walls lined with peeling paint and buzzing routers. Lorraine's fingers flew across a borrowed keyboard, her eyes burning as she sifted through the haul. Bank transfers to Senator Vance, 10 grand to Victor for the firebomb, encrypted threats to end Carter. Pete patched into United servers, his code slicing through firewalls, pulling audio of Gerald barking orders, "Make her a pariah." Jamal cross-checked militia forums, linking Victor's handle to the Arlington attack, his posts a venomous thread of hate. By sunrise, they had a dossier, a digital bomb, and Lorraine uploaded it anonymously to a whistleblower site, her hoodie shadowing her face as she hit send. The files hit the web at 7 a.m., a tsunami of proof crashing through X, sparking riots outside United's Chicago HQ by noon, protesters smashing windows with bricks and rage. Gerald's arrest came fast, FBI agents storming his penthouse. As the leaks went viral, his silver hair wild, his scotch glass shattering on the marble floor. Victor was fired that afternoon, United cutting him loose as headlines screamed, "Airline conspiracy exposed." Lorraine watched from the basement, her hoodie damp with sweat, a flicker of triumph cutting through her exhaustion. She'd turned their own system against them, cracked their armor, sent them reeling. Riots flared nationwide, travelers boycotting United, their stock plunging 12 points. She'd beaten the suspension, flipped the gas station lie, thought she'd reclaimed her ground. But Victor's militia wasn't done, their hate a festering wound, and they struck that night. Maya vanished from the motel at dusk, snatched by 3 masked men in a black van as FAA agents grabbed coffee 50 feet away. Lorraine got the call from a burner phone, a raspy voice snarling, "Retract the leaks, or she's dead." Her stomach dropped, the basement's dim light blurring as she gripped the table, Jamal and Pete freezing mid-code. She'd exposed Victor, torched Gerald's empire, thought she'd locked Maya down. Now this, her girl gone, the militia's claws sinking, deeper than ever. She raced to Fairfax, her car skidding into the motel lot, agents scrambling with useless excuses. "We turned our backs for a minute." The room was trashed, Maya's coat shredded, a note scrawled in red marker, "Back off." Lorraine's knees buckled, her hoodie slipping as she clutched the note, guilt and fury choking her. She rallied, her mind a steel trap, and traced the burner to a warehouse in Manassas, 30 miles out, Jamal's tech skills pinging its signal. She devised a decoy, paying a local cabbie to drop a fake retraction online. Carter admits lies, buying time. She drove alone, her jeans streaked with motel dust, a borrowed pistol from Pete tucked in her waistband, her heart pounding a war drum. The warehouse loomed, a rusted hulk under a moonless sky, its windows dark, the air thick with oil and menace. She slipped inside, shadows swallowing her, and heard Maya's muffled cries from a back room, her daughter bound to a chair, duct tape across her mouth, her braids matted with sweat. 4 militiamen loomed, their camo vests bristling with knives, their faces masked but their hate unhidden. Lorraine moved fast, her pistol raised, voice a hiss. "Let her go now." The leader, a hulking figure with a buzz cut, laughed, his shotgun swinging up, but she fired first, a deafening crack, the bullet ripping through his shoulder. He roared, dropping the gun, and chaos erupted, the others lunging as she dove behind a crate, splinters flying. She shot again, clipping a second man's leg, his scream echoing off the metal walls, and tackled the third, her elbow smashing his nose, blood spraying. Maya thrashed, tipping her chair, and Lorraine reached her, ripping the tape free as bullets whizzed past, the fourth man firing wild. She dragged Maya out, the girl stumbling, and they bolted for the car, gunfire chasing them into the night, tires squealing as they peeled away. Lorraine clutched the wheel, Maya panting beside her, her daughter's sobs a raw edge to the engine's roar. She'd rescued her, outsmarted them, turned their trap into a bloody escape. They hid in a new safe house, a friend's attic in Bethesda, its slanted ceiling a frail shield. She held Maya, her pistol beside her, thinking she'd won this round, beaten the militia, kept her girl alive. But the FBI raided at dawn, agents crashing through the door, their vests stark against the dim light, guns drawn. "Lorraine Carter," the lead agent barked, a stocky woman with a buzz cut. "You're under arrest for hacking United Server's federal cybercrime." Lorraine froze, her pistol clattering to the floor, Maya's gasp piercing the air. The cuffs snapped on, cold metal biting her wrists, an echo of Seattle's cell. The agent shoved the leaked files in her face. "This came from you," her voice a steel blade. Lorraine's stomach churned, her hoodie slipping as she stood, Maya clinging to her arm. She'd cracked United, saved her daughter, thought she'd turned the tide. Now this, the feds flipping her victory into a felony, her own fight criminalized. Agents ransacked the attic, bagging her laptop, her burner phone, every trace of her counterstrike. She'd beaten Gerald's arrest, Victor's firing, the militia's snatch, only to fall into this trap, the system's jaws snapping shut. Lorraine sat in the back of an FBI van, her wrists throbbing. Maya's tear-streaked face burned into her mind as agents pulled her away. She'd gone underground, struck back with Jamal and Pete, thought she'd outrun the lies. But the feds had turned. It branded her a hacker, a felon, her rescue a crime. She stared at the van's blank walls, her resolve flickering, the weight of every blow crashing down. She'd saved Maya, torched United's empire, only to lose her freedom. Victor gloated somewhere, Gerald schemed, and the militia licked their wounds, all free while she rode to lockup. This wasn't over, she'd fight it, but the cost was gutting her alive. Hey folks, what's your take on Lorraine going rogue? Comment number 1 if you'd have hacked United 2 to save your kid, or drop your own spin below. How far would you bend the rules to fight back? Smash that like button if you're stunned by this FBI twist, and subscribe to see Lorraine claw her way out of this mess. Ever had a win turn into a trap this brutal? So, here's the edge of your seat question. Lorraine's cuffed again, but can she turn the Fed's betrayal into her next weapon? Or has Victor's hate finally broken her for good? Stick around to find out. Lorraine Carter sat in the back of the FBI van, her wrists chafed raw by the cuffs, the metal biting deeper with every jolt of the vehicle's tires over DC's potholed streets. Her hoodie hung loose, streaked with attic dust, her pistol confiscated, her fight stripped bare. The raid had torn her from Maya, her daughter's tear-streaked face a fading ghost as agents hauled her away, branding her a cyber criminal for hacking United servers. She'd rescued Maya from the militia, exposed Gerald Maddox's empire, thought she'd turned their hate into ash. Now this, the feds flipping her victory into a felony, her own system snapping shut around her. The van lurched to a stop outside, a federal courthouse, its gray facade looming through the tinted window, and agents shoved her out, their boots scuffing the pavement as they marched her inside. The holding cell was a sterile box, white walls and a steel bench, the air sharp with bleach. Lorraine paced, her sneakers silent against the tile, her mind racing. Marcus Tate, her lawyer, burst in an hour later, his shaved head gleaming under the fluorescence. His suit rumpled from a red-eye flight. "They've got you on hacking," he said, slamming a file on the bench, his voice a low growl. "5 years if it sticks." She nodded, her jaw tight, and handed him Jamal's USB drive smuggled in her sock. "Proof the FBI's dirty," she whispered, her eyes blazing. "Agents on Gerald's payroll. Get me to trial." Marcus grinned, a predator's flash, and bolted, his briefcase swinging as he prepped her defense. The trial hit fast. 3 days later, a packed courtroom in downtown D.C. buzzing with reporters, FAA brass, and a gallery of gawkers. Lorraine stood at the defendant's table, her navy blazer swapped for a gray jumpsuit, her wrists free, but her spirit caged. Judge Leonard Price, a gaunt man with a hawkish nose and thinning hair, presided, his gavel a sharp crack against the wood. "United States versus Lorraine Carter," he intoned, his voice dry, precise. "Charges: unauthorized access to protected systems." Marcus opened, his voice booming. "The FBI's framing my client, Your Honor. She exposed United's stock crimes, and they're burying her for it." He dropped the bomb, playing audio from the USB, a gruff agent's voice. "Maddox pays us to look the other way." The room gasped, prosecutors scrambling, their ties askew. The prosecution, led by a slick Fed named Carla Esposito, countered with a sneer, flashing the leaked files on a screen. "Carter hacked United, broke federal law," she said, her tone icy. "She's no hero, she's a criminal." Marcus pounced, calling Jamal and Pete as witnesses, their laptops open, proving the leaks saved lives, exposed a conspiracy. "The FBI's complicit," he roared, pointing to the audio. "Agents bought by Gerald Maddox to silence her." Lorraine testified, her voice steady, recounting the militia snatch, the rescue, the leaks as self-defense. "They firebombed my daughter," she said, locking eyes with Price. "I had no choice." The gallery murmured, reporters scribbling, and she felt the tide shift, a flicker of hope piercing the gray. Judge Price deliberated overnight, the courtroom reconvening at dawn, sunlight slanting through high windows. "The evidence shows bias in the FBI's actions," he ruled, his voice a hammer. "Charges dismissed. Ms. Carter is acquitted." The room erupted, cheers clashing with groans, and Lorraine exhaled, her shoulders sagging as Marcus hugged her, his grin wide. The FAA reinstated her by noon, Director Hayes on the line, his tone sheepish. "You're back, Lorraine. We were wrong." Victor's militia cronies were jailed, their Manassas hideout raided, and Gerald's empire teetered, his bribes exposed. She left the courthouse, her jumpsuit swapped for jeans, Maya rushing into her arms, her braids swinging. She'd beaten the feds, reclaimed her title, thought it was over. But United struck back that afternoon, a rogue pilot named Travis Boone, a burly ex-Marine loyal to Gerald, taking the controls of Flight 912 from Chicago to Denver. He'd dodged the audits, fueled by Victor's whispers of Carter's ruin, and now saw his chance. At 30,000 feet, Travis yanked the yoke, plunging the plane into a dive, the cabin shaking as passengers screamed, trays crashing. He locked the co-pilot out, his voice crackling over the radio. "This is for United," before slamming into a Colorado mountainside, a fireball erupting, killing 50. The wreckage smoked across news feeds, bodies strewn among twisted metal, and Travis's last words pinned it on Lorraine, a recorded rant. "Her lax regulations let me fly. She's the murderer." Lorraine watched from FAA headquarters, her reinstatement party frozen, champagne flutes clattering as screens blared. The crash. Protests erupted outside, a mob of grieving families and United stooges, their signs jagged with hate. "Carter kills. Resign, murderer." She stood at her desk, her jeans swapped for a black suit, her stomach churning as Carla rushed in, her face pale. "They're saying it's your fault," she whispered, handing over a tablet, Travis's rant looping. Lorraine's knees buckled, her hand gripping the chair, the room spinning. She'd beaten the trial, saved Maya, thought she'd crushed their spine. Now this, A mass casualty lie, 50 lives twisted into her disgrace. Victor walked free that night, a technicality springing him from his latest cell, his smirk wide as he scrolled X, liking posts that branded Lorraine a killer. He'd lost his job, his cronies. But this was gold, a crash to bury her. Gerald, still on bail, grinned from his penthouse, his empire bruised but alive, Travis's sacrifice a gift. Lorraine faced the mob from her cracked window, their chants, a roar, justice for the 50. Rocks sailed, glass shattering anew, and she ducked, her black suit a target. She'd acquitted herself, hugged Maya, felt the FAA's trust return. How had it flipped so fast? The crash report hit her desk by midnight, preliminary data from the black box, a mess of pilot error and United's ignored red flags. She'd pushed audits, flagged Travis years back, but Gerald's bribes had buried it, let him fly. She called Hayes, her voice a rasp. This wasn't me. But he sighed. Public doesn't care, we're scrambling. Protests swelled. Airports picketed, her name a curse on every lip. She sat alone, the office dark, her tablet glowing with hate, Carter's blood on her hands. She'd beaten the feds, turned their trap into triumph, only to face this, a catastrophe pinned on her shoulders. Maya slipped in, her braids tucked under a hoodie, her eyes red from tears. "Mama, they hate you," she whispered, curling beside her, her warmth a frail anchor. Lorraine held her, her chest tight. The crash's fireball burned into her mind. She'd fought Victor's blade, Gerald's lies, the FBI's cuffs, thought she'd won her life back. Now 50 souls haunted her, their deaths a lie she couldn't outrun. She traced Maya's cheek, her resolve flickering, the mob's roar shaking the walls. She'd exposed United's rot, saved her girl, reclaimed her title. But Travis's crash had flipped it, a slaughter to break her. She stood, pulling Maya close, and grabbed her briefcase, its leather a familiar weight. The report lay open, proof of United's negligence, her audits ignored. But the public saw only Travis's rant, her laxness, a killer. Victor led the charge, free again, his hate a megaphone, rallying the mob from shadows. She'd beaten every blow, climbed every cliff only to face this, a national tragedy twisted into her shame. She'd fight it, dig into Travis, expose the truth. But the cost was crushing her, 50 lives a weight she'd carry. The office trembled, rocks pelting the glass, and she braced herself, her black suit a shield, the war far from over. Lorraine Carter stood at her cracked office window in FAA headquarters, the Potomac a distant shimmer through the shattered glass, the night air thick with the roar of the mob below. Protesters swarmed the street, their signs jagged with hate. "Carter kills and resign, murderer," scrawled in red paint, 1,000 voices screaming her name as a curse. Travis Boone's plane crash, 50 lives lost in a Colorado fireball, burned in her mind, his rant pinning it on her lax regulations, a lie that stuck like tar. She'd beaten the FBI's cuffs, reclaimed her title, thought she'd turned the tide, only to face this, a national tragedy twisted into her disgrace. Her black suit hung heavy, sweat-soaked from pacing, her briefcase open on the desk, the crash report a lifeline she couldn't wield fast enough. She rallied her FAA allies by dawn, Carla Nguyen at her side, her laptop glowing with black box data as they dissected Travis's sabotage. "He overrode controls, locked the co-pilot out," Carla said, her voice tight, urgent, pointing to timestamps proving United's negligence. Ignored audits Lorraine had flagged years back. She called in techs, analysts, her team a buzzing hive, pulling maintenance logs, pilot psych evals, every scrap showing Gerald Maddox's bribes had kept Travis aloft. By noon, they had proof, a steel-clad case, and she broadcast it live from the office, her black suit stark against the cracked wall, her voice steady as she held up the report. "This was United's failure," she said, her eyes blazing into the camera. "Not mine. Travis acted alone, and they let him fly." The warm feed hit X, racking up views, and the tide shifted, pundits pausing, families of the 50 wavering. Gerald's conviction came that afternoon, A federal judge slamming him with conspiracy and bribery, 20 years in a cell, his silver hair wild as marshals dragged him out. Victor Hensley, free on his latest technicality, was caught on live TV, a news crew cornering him outside a Chicago bar. His wiry frame hunched as he spat. "She's still a fraud." The crowd turned, bystanders chasing him down an alley, his polo ripping as he fled, his smirk swallowed by their rage. Lorraine watched from her desk, the screen flickering, her chest loosening. She'd flipped the crash lie, exposed the truth, reclaimed her name. Hadn't she? Protesters thinned by dusk, some dropping signs, others drifting away. The mob's roar fading into a murmur. FAA brass called, Hayes gruff but relieved. "You're cleared, Lorraine." Public's turning. She stood tall, her black suit a badge of survival, and hugged Carla, her team cheering as headlines shifted. FAA chief vindicated. She'd beaten Travis's frame up, sent Gerald to prison, watched Victor run. She drove to Bethesda that night, Maya waiting in the attic safe house, her braids tucked under a hoodie, her smile a fragile bloom. "They believe you, Mama," she said, curling into Lorraine's arms, and she felt the weight lift, a fleeting triumph after months of hell. But Victor wasn't done, his hate a coiled snake striking from the shadows. He hid in a Milwaukee motel, cash from Gerald's last loyalists lining his pockets, and leaked an audio that night, a forged masterpiece from a burner phone. "I paid Hensley to crash it," Lorraine's voice said, crisp and cold, a lie spliced from her press clips, all for sympathy. "It hit X at midnight, a viral bomb, 10 million plays by dawn, the fake so seamless it fooled even Carla's ear." Lorraine woke to her phone buzzing, Maya shaking her. "Mama, listen." She played it, her stomach dropping, her own voice a traitor, the words a gut punch she'd never spoken. Protesters surged back, triple the size, their rage a tidal wave crashing against FAA walls. The mob torched her office that morning, Molotov cocktails sailing through the cracked window, flames licking the desk where her briefcase sat, papers curling into ash. She'd evacuated with her team, watching from a block away, her black suit streaked with soot as fire trucks screamed in. Maya's car exploded an hour later, parked outside a friend's house where she'd grabbed clothes, a pipe bomb hidden under the hood, the blast shattering windows, hurling metal into the street. Maya stumbled out, unscathed but sobbing, her hoodie singed, and called Lorraine, her voice a wail. "They're trying to kill me!" Lorraine raced to her, her car skidding through DC's chaos, her chest tight as she pulled Maya into her arms, the girl's trembling a knife to her soul. She fought back, tracing the audio to Gerald's dying loyalists, a tech crew holed up in a Chicago basement, their servers seized by feds she'd tipped off. She broadcast again, her voice hoarse, holding up the crash report. "This is their lie, not mine." But the damage was done, her supporters turning, their faith shredded by the fake. Rioters swarmed her Bethesda safe house that night, bricks smashing the attic windows, their chants a deafening roar. "Murderer, resign!" She and Maya huddled inside, the walls shaking, her pistol drawn but useless against the tide. She'd exposed Travis's sabotage, sent Gerald down, thought she'd won the public back. Now this, a forged confession flipping her into a monster, her office burned, her daughter's life bombed. Lorraine crouched by the attic stairs, Maya clinging to her, the girl's sobs muffled against her shoulder. She'd beaten every blow, the gate, the cuffs, the crash, turned their lies into truth, only to face this, a mob fueled by a ghost's voice. She'd traced the audio, exposed the culprits, but the public didn't care, their rage a blind beast tearing her apart. Victor gloated from his motel, his burner phone discarded, his hate a victory lap as he watched the riots on a grainy TV, his smirk wide. Gerald's loyalists, cuffed in Chicago, grinned too, their last act a dagger to her heart. She'd climbed from the FAA's ashes, reclaimed her name, only to lose it to this, a lie so perfect it broke her world. She held Maya tighter, her black suit a shroud, the attic's slanted ceiling pressing down. She'd sent her team home, Carla's last call a plea. Stay safe. But safety was gone, torched and bombed away. The mob's fire lit the night, their bricks a relentless hail, and she shielded Maya, her mind racing. She'd beaten the system, exposed its rot, thought she'd turned the crash into justice. Now her supporters spat her name, her office smoldered, her daughter's car a wreck. She'd traced the lie, proven it false, but the truth drowned in their fury. Racial hate a fuel Victor stoked from afar. She'd fight, dig deeper, claw her way up. But the cost was crushing her. Every win a step. To this hell, the rioters breached the safe house door at midnight, boots thudding up the stairs, their voices a snarl of slurs and threats. Lorraine dragged Maya to a closet, her pistol trembling in her hand, her breath ragged as she barricaded them in, chairs and boxes piled high. She'd beaten Gerald's cell, Victor's blade, the FBI's trap, thought she'd reclaimed her life. Now this, a mob at her throat, her daughter's sobs a dirge for every victory lost. She'd exposed the crash, turned the public only to face this, a forged audio breaking her world. Victor's hate a wildfire she couldn't quench. The closet shook, fists pounding, and she braced herself, her resolve a flickering flame, the war a nightmare unending. Lorraine Carter crouched in the Bethesda attic closet, her back pressed against the splintered wood, Maya trembling beside her as the mob's fists hammered the barricade. The rioters had breached the safe house, their boots thudding up the stairs, their voices a snarl of slurs and hate fueled by Victor Hensley's forged audio. I paid Hensley to crash it. Her black suit clung to her sweat-soaked skin, her pistol gripped tight, its weight a cold comfort against the chaos. She'd exposed Travis Boone's sabotage, sent Gerald Maddox to prison, thought she'd turn the public back, only to face this, a lie so perfect it torched her office, bombed Maya's car, and drove a mob to her door. The closet shook, chairs toppling, and she braced herself, her breath ragged, her resolve fraying but alive. She shoved Maya deeper into the corner, piling boxes higher, her voice a fierce whisper. "Stay down, baby." The girl's sobs muffled against her hoodie, her braids matted with attic dust, her eyes wide with terror. Lorraine aimed her pistol at the door, her bandaged arm throbbing from Victor's gas station blade, every muscle taut as the pounding grew louder, a rhythmic assault splitting the wood. She'd beaten the FAA's suspension, the FBI's cuffs, the crash's blame, thought she'd reclaimed her life. Now this, a mob at her throat, her daughter's life hanging by a thread. A fist broke through, splinters flying, and she fired, the crack deafening, the bullet ripping into the wall, a warning that stalled them for a heartbeat. The rioters roared, retreating briefly, their curses echoing down the stairs, and Lorraine seized the gap, dragging Maya out, her pistol still raised. They bolted for the back window, its glass cracked from bricks, and she kicked it out, shards tinkling to the lawn below. She lowered Maya first, the girl's feet hitting the grass, then jumped, landing hard, her ankle twisting with a sharp jolt. They ran, the mob's shouts chasing them through the night, headlights flashing as a neighbor's truck peeled out, offering cover. She drove them to a rural cabin in West Virginia, hours from D.C., its pine walls weathered, its isolation a frail shield. She'd escaped, saved Maya again, thought she'd bought time. The cabin was a skeleton of boards and shadows, a single bulb flickering above a scarred table. Lorraine swapped her black suit for jeans, her pistol beside her, a kitchen knife, gleaming on the counter as she watched the windows, the forest's darkness pressing in. Maya curled on a cot, her breathing shallow, her hoodie a cocoon against the nightmare. Lorraine sat up all night, her eyes burning, every creak a threat, the firebomb's glow and the mob's fists replaying in her mind. She'd exposed Gerald's loyalists, turned the crash lie, thought she'd outrun their hate. Now this, hiding like prey, her daughter broken, her victory's ash. She gripped the knife, her resolve stealing, a plan forming through the haze. By dawn, she broadcast a desperate plea from the cabin, a shaky phone stream to X, her jeans streaked with dirt, her voice raw. "This is the truth," she said, holding up the crash report. Eddie's confession, the militia's seized chats. Victor's lie torched my life, but I'm not the monster. It hit 1 million views by noon, the public's rage wavering. Some tweeting apologies, "We got it wrong." Victor was caught that afternoon, nabbed in Milwaukee after a tip, cuffed on live TV, confessing under pressure. Maddox's crew faked it. Gerald's empire collapsed, United filing bankruptcy, its stock a penny's ghost. Lorraine watched from the cabin, her phone glowing, her chest loosening. She'd flipped it again, saved her name, thought it was over. Feds raided the Chicago basement that night. Gerald's loyalists hauled out, their servers smashed, the audios, source gutted. FAA brass called, Hayes gruff. "You're clear, Lorraine, come back." She stood by the cabin's window, Maya asleep behind her, the forest still, and felt a flicker of triumph, her genes a badge of survival. She'd beaten the mob, turned the lie, kept her girl alive. She stepped outside at dusk, the air crisp, with pine, her phone buzzing with news. Carter vindicated. She'd climbed from the attic's hell, exposed Victor's confession, thought she'd broken their spine. Then a crack split the silence, a sniper's bullet tearing through her chest, blood blooming on her shirt as she crumpled to the porch. Maya screamed, rushing out, her hoodie flapping as she dropped beside Lorraine, her hands pressing the wound, blood soaking her fingers. A militia holdout, a lean figure in camo, melted into the trees, his rifle slung, Victor's last loyal dog striking from the dark. Sirens wailed, a neighbor's call bringing medics, their lights flashing through the dusk as they hauled Lorraine onto a stretcher, her breathing shallow, her jeans dark with blood. Maya clung to her, sobbing, "Don't leave me." As the ambulance roared to a hospital in Charleston, surgeons racing her to the OR, the bullet lodged near her lung. She'd broadcast the truth, caught Victor, thought she'd won, only to take this, a sniper's shot flipping victory into a fight, for life. She woke 2 days later, tubes snaking from her chest, the hospital room a blur of white and beeping machines. Maya sat beside her, her braids loose, her eyes red but fierce, holding her hand. "You made it, Mama," she whispered, and Lorraine squeezed back, her throat raw, her body a map of pain. The nation watched, news feeds looping her survival. FAA chief shot, clings to life, protests shifting to vigils, candles flickering outside headquarters. Victor's confession aired again, his cuffs tight, his smirk gone, and Lorraine felt the tide turn, her chest aching but her spirit stirring. She'd beaten the sniper, lived through the hate, thought it was finally over. But Victor escaped. Custody that night, a bribed guard slipping him a key, his wiry frame vanishing into Milwaukee's alleys, vowing revenge on a burner call to his last crony. She's not done yet. Lorraine lay in the hospital bed, her jeans swapped for a gown, the knife's edge of his threat slicing through her fragile win. Medics had saved her, the public cheered her, Gerald's empire was dust. But Victor roamed free, his hate a shadow she couldn't kill. She'd broadcast her plea, turned the mob, caught him on TV, only to face this. A killer loose, her survival, a taunt. Maya slept beside her, the room's hum a fragile peace, and Lorraine stared at the ceiling, her resolve flickering, the war a relentless beast. She traced the bandage on her chest, the bullet's path a dull throb, her mind replaying. Every blow, Victor's gate sneer, the firebomb, the crash, the sniper's crack. She'd climbed from every pit, exposed every lie, kept Maya alive, thought she'd broken their hold. Now this, Victor's escape a gut punch, his vow a promise of more blood. She'd turned the public, survived the shot, felt the nation's applause. But he was out there, a ghost with a grudge, his militia's last fang bared. She'd fight, track him, end it, but the cost was crushing her, every breath a battle, her victories a house of cards in his wind. The hospital window framed a gray dawn, the world beyond a haze of hope and hate. Lorraine shifted, pain spiking, and gripped Maya's hand, her daughter's warmth a tether. She'd beaten the attic mob, the sniper's aim, turned the crash, lie into truth, only to face this, Victor free, his hate a live wire. She'd exposed Gerald's fall, caught Victor's confession, thought she'd locked him down. Now he roamed, a specter of her failures, his escape a slap to her survival. She'd climb again, hunt him. But the war was breaking her, piece by bloody piece, and she wondered how much she had left to give. Lorraine Carter lay in the Charleston hospital bed, her chest a lattice of bandages, the bullet's path a dull ache beneath the sterile white gown. The room hummed with machines, their beeps a steady pulse against the quiet. Maya asleep beside her, her braids spilling over the chair's edge, her hand clasped in Lorraine's. 2 days had passed since the sniper's shot, a militia holdout's last strike from Victor Hensley's hate, and she'd survived, her lungs rasping, but alive. The nation watched, vigils glowing outside FAA headquarters, her survival a headline. Carter beats death, her broadcast from the cabin flipping the crash lie into truth. Victor's escape gnawed at her, his vow of revenge a shadow over her fragile win. But she clung to the moment. Maya's warmth a lifeline, her resolve stirring through the pain. She recovered over weeks. The hospital a cocoon of white walls and antiseptic air, her strength creeping back with every shallow breath. FAA brass visited, Hayes gruff but firm. "You're back when you're ready," his handshake a rare thaw. She nodded, her gown swapped for jeans by discharge day, her chest tender but her eyes blazing. She spearheaded reforms from a temporary office in D.C., her briefcase reloaded with policies, slashing biased airlines with audits, grounding United's remnants, their bankruptcy a tombstone. Victor was hunted nationwide, his face plastered on every screen, Milwaukee's alleys yielding, no trace, his wiry frame a ghost in the wind. Lorraine pushed on, her jeans a badge of grit, her reforms a hammer on the system's rot, her survival a rallying cry. By summer, she stood tall, her black suit crisp again, her chest healed, the scar a faint line under her shirt. Time named, her Person of the Year, a glossy cover with her steady gaze, the Regulator who fought back, her legacy etched in ink. She moved Maya into a new D.C. apartment, its high-rise windows gleaming, FAA security a constant shadow. Protests faded, vigils turned to cheers, her name a beacon. Carter cleared. She'd beaten Victor's gate, the firebomb, the crash, the sniper. Thought she'd locked her world down. Gerald rotted in prison, United was dust, and Victor ran, his militia shattered. She stood at her office window, the Potomac a silver thread, and felt triumph, hard won, hers at last. But the war wasn't done. Its last twist coiled in the one place she'd never look. Maya, 19 and fractured, had hardened in the shadows. The dorm attack, the firebomb, the mob's hate-carving scars deeper than Lorraine knew. She'd clung to her mother, her sobs a constant through the chaos, but beneath it rage simmered. A fire stoked by every slur, every bomb, every night in hiding. Lorraine missed it, too buried in reforms, her eyes on Victor, her heart on survival. Maya slipped out that fall, her braids tucked under a cap, her hoodie a shroud as she tracked Victor. Her political science book swapped for a stolen gun, her mind a storm of vengeance. She found him in a Detroit warehouse, a rusted shell off the river, his hideout tipped by a militia defector she'd bribed with her college fund. Victor crouched over a burner phone, his wiry frame gaunt, his smirk faded but alive, plotting. His next strike, Maya burst in, her gun raised, her voice a raw scream. "For Mom!" The shot cracked, live-streamed by a camera Victor had set to taunt Lorraine, his blood pooling on the concrete as he slumped, his eyes wide with shock. The feed hit X, 5 million views in an hour. Maya's face frozen in fury, her braids swinging, the nation watching her kill. Lorraine sat in her office, her black suit pristine, her tablet glowing with the stream, her breath stopping as Maya's voice echoed, "For Mom!" The room spun, her briefcase tumbling, papers scattering as she gripped the desk, her chest scar pulsing with a phantom ache. Maya was arrested on the spot, Detroit PD cuffing her as she dropped the gun, her hoodie soaked with Victor's blood, her eyes hollow but unrepentant. Lorraine raced to Michigan, her car skidding through the night, her mind a wreck of guilt and disbelief. She'd beaten every blow, turned every lie, thought she'd shielded Maya, built a legacy. Now this, her daughter a killer, her fight birthing, a monster, the live stream a public execution she couldn't unsee. She reached the precinct, her black suit rumpled, and saw Maya through glass, her braids matted, her face a mask of rage and ruin. The FAA fired Lorraine that dawn, Hayes' call a curt blow. "You've lost control, Carter. This is violence you instigated." Her reforms unraveled, airlines clawing back power, her legacy torched by Maya's shot. She stood outside the precinct, her jeans swapped back, the Detroit River a gray smear behind her, shunned by aides, reporters, the public who'd cheered her weeks before. Maya's trial loomed, a media circus. FAA chief's daughter kills, her plea of trauma. Drowned by cries for justice, Victor's death a martyr's crown for his hate. Lorraine watched from a rented room, her TV flickering with Maya's face, her own name a curse again. Carter's spawn. She sat alone, her black suit folded in a drawer, her jeans a shroud of defeat, the trial's gavel a distant thud. Through the screen, she'd climbed from Victor's gate. The firebomb, the crash, the sniper, turned every lie into truth, built a fortress of reform, thought she'd won. Now this, Maya's bullet flipping it all, her daughter's rage a mirror, of her fight twisted into blood. She'd shielded her, saved her, only to lose her to this. A live-streamed slaughter undoing every victory. The nation turned, her reforms gutted, her name spat. The FAA a ghost of her vision. She traced the scar on her chest, her fingers trembling. The war's cost a weight she couldn't shed. Lorraine replayed the stream, Maya's scream a loop in her mind. "For Mom!" She'd fought for justice, exposed United's rot, kept Maya alive through hell, thought she'd taught her strength. But the dorm's glass, the fire's roar, the mob's bricks had forged something else. A vengeance Lorraine hadn't seen, brewing. She'd beaten Gerald's cell, Victor's blade, the FBI's trap, the sniper's shot, turned the public twice, only to face this, her own blood breaking her world. Maya sat in a cell, her trial a countdown, her life a price for Victor's end, and Lorraine sat powerless, her legacy ash, her daughter's hate a wound deeper than any bullet. She stood, her jeans stiff with days of wear, and walked to the window, Detroit's skyline a blur of steel and smoke. She'd built a career on safety, fairness, climbed from audits to chief, thought she'd fix the system. Now it spat her out. Maya's shot a final blow, her fight a spark that burned them both. She'd tracked Victor, exposed his lies, survived, his hate only to lose her girl to it, a live-streamed nightmare she couldn't rewind. The trial droned on, Maya's face a stranger's, her braids a rope tying Lorraine to every failure. She'd won the war, killed the beast, only to birth another, her daughter's hands red with her own blood. Lorraine packed her briefcase one. Last time, its leather worn, its contents a ghost of reforms undone. She'd beaten every cliff, turned every lie, thought she'd secured her name, her family. Now Maya faced 20 years, her youth a sacrifice to Victor's end, and Lorraine faced exile, her scar a map of every cost. She left the room, the TV off, the trial's hum a memory, her steps slow on the cracked pavement. She'd fought for aviation, for justice, for Maya, only to lose it all to this, a reversal so sharp it cut her soul. The river flowed, gray and endless, and she walked into the dusk alone, her war's end a tragedy she'd never outrun. Lorraine Carter's journey teaches us profound truths about resilience, systemic bias, and the cost of fighting injustice. Her battle began with a flight attendant's prejudice, spiraled through mob violence, corporate conspiracies, and a sniper's bullet, only to end in a heartbreaking betrayal by her daughter, Maya. The first lesson is the unrelenting nature of racism. Victor's initial sneer wasn't a one-off, but a spark that ignited a firestorm, showing how deeply entrenched bias can escalate into life-shattering hate. Lorraine faced it head-on, proving that courage and intellect can topple giants like United Airlines. Yet the second lesson stings. Victory often comes at a brutal price. She lost her career, her reforms, and her daughter to the very fight she waged. A reminder that justice isn't always clean or complete. The third lesson lies in unintended consequences. Lorraine's fierce protection of Maya forged a warrior, but one whose rage turned inward, killing Victor and unraveling everything her mother built. It's a gut punch. Our battles can scar those we love most, twisting them in ways we can't foresee. Finally, the story screams that systems, be it airlines, law enforcement, or even the FAA, can bend to protect their own, leaving the righteous to claw through the wreckage. Lorraine's tale isn't just a story, it's a mirror to our world's flaws. So what do you take from this? How far would you push against a system that fights dirty, knowing it might cost you everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like if Lorraine's grit struck a chord, and subscribe for more tales of battling the odds. Share this with someone who needs to see resilience in action. Thanks for joining this wild ride. Here's to finding strength in the toughest storms.